At Christmas time, we hear the story of Jesus' birth, how Joseph and Mary traveled to Bethlehem, how the angels appeared to shepherds, how Mary treasured up all these things and pondered them in her heart. But Matthew begins the story in a different way, a curious way. He wrote, "This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David." Now, you might think that Matthew would go on to describe the perfect family tree. But instead, Matthew makes sure that we hear about the sinners, the failures, and the outsiders who are part of Jesus' family tree. Drawing attention to all the bad apples isn't a very convincing way to announce to the world that the Savior has come. Unless the sinners, the failures, and the outsiders weren't just part of the Christmas story, but the point of the Christmas story.
Well, good morning, everyone. Today we are in part 2 of our series, Family Tree. And if you missed last week, this is our Christmas series that we're doing in the weeks leading up to Christmas. And I mentioned last week that in the Bible we have 4 different accounts of the life of Jesus. 4 different men wrote a biography about his life, but only 2 of those men wrote about the Christmas story, about how Jesus was born. Now, Luke was the one who wrote the very famous Christmas story, the one you've probably heard at Christmas time. It's the one where angels are showing up and there's shepherds living out in the fields nearby, and Mary treasures up all these things and ponders them in her heart. But Matthew, when he sat down to write the story of Christmas, he began in a very different way. He thought, I'm not going to start with the angels. I'm going to start with something far more exciting than that. I'm going to start with a genealogy. And these are the parts of the Bible that we look at, and we might skip those parts. But when you remember what Matthew's original intent was, namely, to convince his first century Jewish audience that Jesus was the Messiah that they had been waiting for centuries, the one sent from God to save them, he had to convince them that Jesus was related to Abraham, because they thought if he's not related to Abraham, we know he's not our Messiah. And he had to demonstrate that Jesus was related to King David, because God had promised King David, you will never have a descendant who fails to sit on the throne. So they were looking for someone who was related to Abraham, related to King David. So where we see a genealogy, Matthew's first century audience would have seen a resume. They would have seen a reference list. They would have seen someone who they can ask, does this guy check out? Does his story check out? Who is he related to? And is he related to the right people? And Matthew says that's the perfect way to begin the Christmas story. Now, some of us today, if there's parts in our resume that we don't want people to know about, we leave those parts out. If there's former managers or bosses that might not give you a good reference, you don't put them on your reference list. But Matthew does something that's just plain odd. In his genealogy, he goes out of the way to draw the reader's attention to all of the bad apples in Jesus' family tree. In fact, in his genealogy, he does something unheard of in that generation. He includes women and not just men. That's fine for us, but in that day, it was all about, who's your daddy? So it was always so-and-so was the father of so-and-so, was the father of some guy I've never heard of. Not only that, he includes foreigners in the family tree of Jesus. In other words, he makes a point, this Jewish Messiah you've been waiting for, he's not even pure blood. He's not even pure Jewish. And oh, by the way, some of the most disgusting, immoral acts you can imagine, they were done by people who were the ancestors of Jesus. And last week we said the reason why Matthew goes out of his way to draw our attention to all of the bad apples and all of the outsiders that Jesus was related to is not just because they were part of the Christmas story, they're the point of the Christmas story. Which means that the Christmas story is the story about us. The story of Christmas is a story for people who are outsiders when it comes to God. It's for people who are some bad apples. It's the story of you, and it's the story of me. But as we're reading it, that has some implications. First of all, when you read Luke's Christmas story, that's the one that gives us all the nice, warm, fuzzy feelings. That's where we think of peace on earth, goodwill toward men, hope for the world. But when we read Matthew's account, because he's drawing our attention to all these outsiders and all these bad apples, we associate it more with guilt than with peace on earth. That's a kind of a predominant theme running through Matthew's genealogy as he prepares to tell his Christmas story. Now, guilt is something that we can all relate to. And it's a horrible feeling. None of us likes it, but we don't stop long enough to think about what it is. Guilt is basically the sensation we get when we do something that we know is wrong, but we do it anyway. Or when there's something that we know is right that we ought to do, but we just decide, I'm not going to do that. That's what guilt is. So, for example, if you said to yourself at any time this week, I think I'll have a slice of pumpkin pie, and an hour later you realize you've had the pumpkin pie, the apple pie, the cherry pie, and a whole quart of Cool Whip on top, you might feel guilt. And the reason why you feel guilt is because you did something that you believe is wrong. Okay? Nobody else believes it's wrong. They may or may not. You believe it's wrong. Now, you can believe something is wrong for any number of reasons, okay? It might be the way you were raised. It might be something you read in the Bible or heard in church. It might be something that society tells us. It might be based on your experience. But when you do something that you believe is wrong, what we experience is guilt. Let's say you've been having this battle with your kids all semester long about getting their homework done before they play their video games or before they go outside or getting their chores done or whatever responsibility you have in your home. And once again, your kid doesn't do their responsibility and you lose your temper and you just yell at your kid. Not you, other people do this. I know you wouldn't do this. And later on, you're thinking about it and you're like, you know, the way I handled their misbehavior actually made the situation worse. The way I handled their misbehavior actually drove a wedge between us in our relationship. I shouldn't have handled it that way, and you begin to feel guilt. Guilt is what happens when you did something that you believe is wrong. And there's a very specific way we experience guilt. Guilt is a feeling of being morally indebted. See, when you do something wrong against someone, you create a debt-to-debtor relationship morally in a relationship. That's why we have phraseology like, I hurt you, I feel like I owe you an apology. Now that's financial language. Why do we use that when it comes to making things right? Because guilt is a feeling of being morally indebted. Or we say things like, I need to make this up to you. Because when we do wrong in a relationship, we create a debt-to-debtor inequity. And when we feel indebted, we want to make it up, we feel like we owe people things. Now, this feeling can happen with any number of parties. You might feel morally indebted to God. I didn't live up to what I believe God wants out of me, so now you feel indebted to God. It can be in a relationship, like I said, with your kids or with a spouse or with a friend where you didn't do what you were supposed to do, so now you feel morally indebted to the relationship. Or many times this is just to yourself. I feel morally indebted to myself because what I did hurt me and I did not live up to my standard or my character, so now I feel indebted to me. Now, this isn't the definition of guilt. This is just how we experience it. This is how we feel guilt. Now, I haven't told you anything you don't already know. Maybe I put some language around it you hadn't thought of, but this is something that is universal to all of us. Many of us live with this many times. Most of us live with this every single day. This is 101 level. But now I want to take it to 201 level. Guilt is a feeling that no one enjoys. So we want to get rid of it. We want it to be out of our lives. In my experience as a pastor, I've seen two predominant ways that men and women try to deal with the guilt, this feeling of moral indebtedness that we have. The first way we try to get rid of it is to justify ourselves. Here's why what I did actually wasn't so bad as it first appeared, which is why I'm not as morally indebted as I feel like I should be. Yes, I had 4 pieces of pie. But have you met my in-laws? I was just trying to get through the afternoon with them. Yeah, I yelled at my kid, but they had it coming. They really deserved it. We've been over this a dozen times. Yes, I had an affair, but my spouse hasn't been meeting my needs. we try to justify our actions, we try to justify our sin, so that when you look at it from the right angle, when you look at it from a certain perspective, it really wasn't as bad as it seemed to be at first. Therefore, my moral indebtedness isn't as deep as it felt at first. And if I can justify in my own eyes what I've done, maybe I'm not even indebted at all. And if I don't feel indebted, then the guilt goes away. As a pastor, you would not believe the sins I have heard people try to justify. And the reason why we do it is to get rid of that feeling of guilt. And if we can justify what we've done, the indebtedness doesn't feel as bad. There's a second way we try to deal with it, and that is to hide. To take whatever it is we've done and the guilt that we feel and bury it and stuff it, and not bring it up again, and just in silence deal with whatever guilty or indebted feelings we feel, and we find all kinds of ways to self-medicate that feeling away, but we're not going to ever bring it out into the light of day. Today, we're going to meet someone who is related to Jesus, who had a lot of moral indebtedness. And we're going to see how he tried to deal with his guilt by justifying what he had done, and how he tried to deal with his guilt by hiding what he had done. But as we read his story, what we discover is the more he hid what he had done, the greater and greater the guilt and the sense of indebtedness grew. And the more he tried to justify what he had done, the more of a monster, the more of an evil and wicked person he became on the inside. Finally, at the end of his story, we see how he recognized the way to be free of guilt. So, in your program this morning, there's a few fill-in-the-blanks to help you follow along if you're a person who likes to take notes. Now, here's the big idea I want to get us started with today when it comes to this idea of guilt and what it is. Guilt is caused by sin. Hey, when you do something that's wrong, that's what causes it, that's what triggers it, but guilt is fueled by secrecy. It's caused by whatever you've done, but that doesn't fuel it, and that doesn't allow it to stay, and that doesn't make it grow. Secrecy is what makes guilt grow. Secrecy is what fuels it. Secrecy is what turbocharges it in your life. And today we're going to see from an ancestor of Jesus how to actually be rid of it. So, we're going to find out who our mystery character is as we look at Matthew chapter 1, where he sat down to write the Christmas story. Matthew wrote a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Dun, dun, dun. Now, this, again, for most of us, this doesn't mean anything. Many of us have never even heard of Judah, and even if you've heard of Judah, you've never heard of Tamar. But again, to Matthew's original audience, they would think, Matthew, why didn't you just say Abraham was the father of Isaac, was the father of Jacob, was the father of Judah, was the father of Perez, and just keep going? Why did you bring up Tamar? She doesn't belong in the story. Because what we're going to see today is that Judah and Tamar, they had some dirty little secrets together. And in fact, what we're going to read today is something that most churches would never read in church. It just goes to all kind of un-Christmassy places that kind of make our skin crawl a little bit, and it's a little bit creepy, and most pastors would never read to you from the Bible what I'm going to read to you today. So if you're new to Hope, welcome. This is what we do here. It's in the Bible. We'll get there eventually. Give me enough Sundays. But it's in their keeping of dirty little secrets that the guilt grew and grew and grew. Now, if you've never heard of Judah, you've probably heard of one of his famous brothers. Jacob had 12 sons. 2 of them were Judah and Joseph. Joseph was the guy who had the richly ornamented robe or the multiple colored robe, the big fancy robe. Maybe you've heard of the Technicolor Dreamcoat, Donny Osmond, depending on your generation and how old you are. But here was the story. Jacob had 12 sons, and he loved one son, Joseph, way more than his other sons. And he let everybody know it. Joseph was the apple of his eye. Jacob doted on him. He gave him gifts. He spoiled him rotten, while he treated all of Joseph's brothers like second-rate family members. And over time, this really irritated the 11 brothers. What's worse, Joseph became spoiled, he became arrogant, he became condescending, and he was just rude and disrespectful to all of his 11 brothers. So one day, Joseph's 11 brothers, they're out in the field, they're out watching sheep, they're in the middle of nowhere. Jacob sends Joseph to go see what his brothers are up to and bring back a report, and he knows it's going to be negative. So when his brothers see Joseph coming out, the beloved son that they all detest, they say, "Hey, here comes Joseph. Let's get rid of him. Let's kill him. Then we'll never have to, hear about how awesome he is again, and why couldn't we all be like Joseph, and maybe our father will finally start treating us like his own sons." But Judah had an idea of what they could do instead of killing him. In Genesis chapter 37, we find out Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood?" Hey guys, I've been thinking, if we just kill our brother, we don't actually get anything. So what if we could get something out of getting rid of him? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. They were traders who were traveling through in a caravan. Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. His brothers agreed. So that's a nice, warm, Christmassy thought. Let's not murder him. He's our brother. Let's sell him to these slave traders. Oh, yeah. And they all hold hands and sing a song together. And they decide, let's sell Joseph to these slave traders, and then we will be rid of him. He'll be out of our lives. Well, how are they going to break the news to their father Jacob? Here's the plan. Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." And now Judah and his brothers have a secret. They sold their brother Joseph into slavery and lied to their father and misled him to believe that a wild animal had killed him. And every year at Thanksgiving dinner, every year at Christmas, there's an empty chair that's Joseph's. And their father goes into mourning, and he's a devastated man, yet they keep their guilt hidden. They keep their guilt secret. And inside, it begins to eat away at them. Well, that's Judah's first secret. Judah had a second dirty little secret. Most of the rest of the book of Genesis follows the story of Joseph, how he was sent down to Egypt, and he's a remarkable young man, and he was a slave in Potiphar's house, and it just tells the story of how he ended up becoming the prime minister of Egypt over a span of 20 years. God was with him and blessed him. But before the narrator takes us to the story of Joseph, the narrator tells us the next chapter of Judah's life. Genesis 38 is the one that we usually skip over in church. Here's what happened. Judah got married, and he had 3 sons of his own. And when the oldest son, his name was I don't know why he named him you can figure that out for yourself. His son's name was and when he was old enough to get married, he went and found a wife for his son to get married. They had arranged marriages in those days. Judah was a man of wealth and standing, so he had to find a family of wealth and standing with a daughter of marrying age, and he finally found her, so he got these guys married off together. Here's what happened, Genesis 38. Judah got a wife for his firstborn. I don't know why I did that. And her name was, what was her name? Tamar. Here's the gal that was mentioned in the genealogy. You're like, wait, I thought Judah had a son, Perez, and their mother was Tamar. What's going on here? It gets freaky. Not very Christmassy. Her name was Tamar, but Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. Now, we don't know this is his only verse in the Bible. We don't know anything else about him, but he was apparently so violent, so evil, so wicked, God said, I am doing the world a favor. I am taking you out, and was put to death. Now, Tamar that means she is now a widow at a very young age. In those days, a young woman would be married in her early teenage years. So she would have been married off to Ur. Now Ur is struck dead by the Lord because he was such a vile, wicked man. I'm getting the impression she probably wasn't too sad about that if he was that much of a monster. But now there was a problem. In those days, there was a cultural law called the Levirate law. Here's what it meant. If a woman's husband died, her father-in-law, the father of the deceased husband, had an obligation to provide for the widow. And if that man had another son who was a bachelor, that son was required to take the widow as his wife. Unless she didn't want to marry him, she didn't have to, but he was required to ask for her hand in marriage. Now, the reason for that was in those days, this was not a free market society, and women did not have rights like we do today. It was a society where women couldn't have jobs, couldn't own property, couldn't make money, and to be a widow was to be the most vulnerable person in society. And in those days, if there was a family and they wanted to marry off their son, they wouldn't want him to marry the widow. They would want him to marry a virgin, not someone who had already been married. So she was in a very precarious place. So the law was set up in a way that if the father had another son, that son was to marry the widow. So that's what happened. Judah provided for her. He had a second son. That son's name was Onan. Onan took Tamar as his wife, but Onan also was a wicked man. I'm not going to read those verses. You can read those at home alone. We do know what he did, and God struck him down dead too. And now, all of a sudden, Ur is dead, Onan is dead, and Tamar is twice a widow. But Judah has a third son. His third son's name is Shelah. And Judah says, I can't give Shelah to this woman. She's like the black widow or something. So here's what happens. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, live as a widow in your father's household until my son Shelah grows up, for he thought he may die too, just like his brothers. So he's thinking to himself, there is no way I'm going to give her my son Shelah. This girl is bad news. She must be doing something that my sons are dying. Now, what's he doing? He has raised two absolutely wicked, evil sons. But he's blaming Tamar. Tamar hasn't done anything wrong. She just got married off to two wicked men. It was an arranged marriage. But he needs a way to justify, maybe it was the way he raised his sons, maybe it was just to justify how evil and wicked they had become. He needs a way to lessen the guilt in his life about the monsters his sons turned out to be, so he tries to blame her. Maybe it was her, maybe she did it, maybe it has something to do with how wicked she is, and he refuses to take responsibility for the evil that his own sons committed before the Lord, that they were struck dead. So he says, there is no way I'm going to give her Shelah, my son. Tell you what, sweetheart, go live at your dad's house, live like a widow, and when he's old enough, don't call us, we'll call you. We'll get all the details worked out for the marriage, but of course, eventually Tamar catches on. He's not going to meet his obligation. So Tamar went to live in her father's household, and she waits, and she waits, and she waits. Well, in the meantime, something happened. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. So Judah himself, his own wife, dies now, and now he's a widower. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah, to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend, Hirah the Adullamite, went with him. So it's sheep shearing time, and the only really cultural equivalent for us today is it's hunting camp. It's where the guys go, and they have a great time, and they probably drink a few too many beers, and they're just all out by the front. The difference is, as they're shearing sheep, this is money-making season, so in addition to being deer hunting camp, it's also raining, okay? So everyone's about to make a lot of money, so everyone's just in a great mood. It's party time. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. So Tamar's sitting at home in her dad's house, waiting for Shelah to grow up, and she realizes he's not going to do what he's supposed to do. He is going to leave me as a vulnerable widow, even though she has done nothing wrong. She has done everything the right way. So she comes up with a plan. And this is where it gets a little, just to warn you before we get there. She takes off her widow's clothes and she disguises herself, and she goes to the intersection where she knows her father-in-law, Judah, is about to pass by. Here's what happens. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." And what, told you it's not very Christmassy, but Matthew sent us off in this direction. "And what will you give me to sleep with you?" she asked. "I'll send you a young goat from my flock," he said, which I guess was the going rate for that sort of thing back then. "Will you give me something as a pledge until you spend it? Do you have the goat on you?" "No, I left my goat at home." "Well, what are you going to give me as collateral so I know I'm going to get my goat?" So she asked for that. He said, "What pledge should I give you?" "Your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand," she answered. Now, this is basically our equivalent of handing over your wallet with your driver's license and credit cards. Okay, this is your seal. That was your official signature back then, and its cord, you wore it around your neck, and the staff in your hand. This is like saying, I want to keep your wallet and driver's license until I get my goat. That's the deal. So he gave them to her. Not a good idea. He gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. Here's what happens next. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. So she goes, she knows Judah's character. She knows enough about Judah to know that if she looks like a prostitute, he's going to hire her like a prostitute, and she has his identification now. Now, in that day and age, if she became pregnant, that would be something she should hide because she is in danger. Instead, she tells everybody she can, "Good news, I'm pregnant," and she plans a baby shower. And eventually, word gets back to Judah about what Tamar has done. About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law, Tamar, is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant." So one day after deer camp's over and life's back to normal, 3 months later, someone comes in one day, Judah, we've got a problem. Your daughter-in-law, Tamar, she is not living at home with her father like you told her to. She's become a prostitute, and now she's pregnant." Now, every once in a while in the media, there is a story about someone like a politician who comes out really strongly on a social issue. Let's say there's a politician who comes out really strongly against same-sex marriage. And then that politician is caught in a same-sex relationship. Have you heard stories like that in the media before? Have you ever known someone who has a very self-righteous front on certain social issues, but come to find out they're actually engaged in that very thing? That's what Judah's doing here. Judah's got some dirty little secrets, doesn't he? But when he finds out that Tamar, when he hears the report that Tamar is a prostitute and that Tamar is pregnant, how does this man who's got dirty little secrets respond? Because if he had dirty little secrets, maybe he would say, "Well, who are we to judge?" Because he knows that he could be judged, but he doesn't. He gets all self-righteous. Judah said, "Bring her out and have her burned to death." Now, that's not even the appropriate consequence for this sort of thing in that day and age. And if Tamar had done something that deserved capital punishment, the way they would have handled that is to stone someone to death. Judah wants her burned to death. That's a pretty powerful reaction. Why is Judah reacting in this way? And in fact, in the Hebrew language, He just says two words. It says, burn now. He wants her burned to death in a violent, painful way. He wants her executed. He's burning with anger inside. So he wants her burned to death outside. Why is he so angry? Well, remember back to verse 11? Judah's not going to give her his son Shelah because he's convinced she's the problem. He's not taking responsibility for his failures. He's not taking responsibility for his son's failures and sins. He has to justify now why he's going to do the wicked thing and not give her Shelah in marriage. So to justify his sin, to justify his guilt, he has to convince himself that this inequity really isn't an inequity. He has to look at it from an angle where he's actually doing the right thing so he doesn't feel any guilt. So what does he do? He spends the years convincing himself, this is a wicked woman. This is an evil woman. The problem is with her. And as soon as evidence comes out that says she's wicked, aha, I knew it. This woman is trouble. Burn her for what she's done. He's become a monster on the inside as he has tried to justify the guilt and the sin and the failure in his own life. And that's what happens when we justify our guilt. When we look at our past, when we look at our failures, when we look at our sin, and we try to explain away why what we did actually wasn't so bad, why it actually isn't moral indebtedness, we become monsters inside, like Judah. But Tamar has something that belongs to Judah, doesn't she? Here's our fill in the blank. The greatest danger in our hearts is the desire to justify ourselves. Nothing is more dangerous to us on the inside, to who we are, to our character, to our spiritual and emotional health, than to justify and explain why our sin really wasn't sin. So, Tamar's brought out. As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. I am pregnant by the man who owns these, she said. So she hands the cord and the seal and the staff to a messenger, and the messenger walks over to Judah, carrying them, kind of staring at him, and says, hey, Judah, Tamar says that the guy who impregnated her is the guy who owns this stuff, but I don't know what she's talking about. Do you know what she's talking about? Judah's like, put away the matches, let's restack the firewood. Hold on, time out, everyone, time out, hold on. Let's not have a burning today. Let's just talk this out, all right? She said, and she added, see if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are. Now, the word recognize is an important word. It means to discern or to perceive or to realize. Now, it did not require any processing ability to recognize whose these were. He knew whose it was his. What is she asking him to realize? What is she asking him to perceive? She's saying, hey, if I deserve to burn for my sin of prostitution, it takes two to tango, and whoever owns these, he's the other guilty party, so we can tie him to the pole with me. Do you recognize Judah? Look how Judah responds. Judah recognized them. The Hebrew text doesn't have the word them. It just says Judah recognized. What did he recognize? His sin. You can tell by how he responds. He recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah. He recognized what he was doing. He recognized his fault. He recognized his guilt, and he said, she is more righteous than I am. Yes, in spite of her sin in doing this, she is the just one. She is the righteous one. In spite of her sin, she is righteous. I am the one who has done wrong. And he has a breakthrough. And he drops the anger, and he drops the self-righteousness, and he drops the justification, and he recognizes his sin. And that's Genesis chapter 38. And then Narrator takes us to the life of Joseph, and Judah's left hanging there. And we go all the way through the story of Joseph and how Joseph was in Egypt and he was a slave, and then he went to the dungeon, and then he became the prime minister of Egypt, and he's saving the whole world because there's a famine in the land, and there's plenty of food in Egypt because of Joseph's leadership. And eventually, Jacob sends Judah and his brothers to Egypt to buy food from Joseph. I'm not going into detail now. If you're curious, this last summer I preached a whole series on the life of Joseph called Dream On. It's about how we would live our lives if we were convinced that God is with us no matter what. But Judah and his brothers are still carrying this dirty little secret of what they did to Joseph. And now they're standing before Joseph, the prime minister of Egypt, but the narrator tells us so brilliantly, the narrator writes, the brothers could not recognize. You see the theme of Judah's life? They took Joseph's torn robe to Jacob, and Jacob recognized them. Tamar gave his cord and seal and staff to Judah, and he recognized them. These are all pivotal moments in Genesis. His brothers go down to Joseph, but they don't recognize him, but he recognized them. And he wants to know if their hearts have changed. He wants to know if they are still evil, wicked people on the inside, or if they have recognized their sin, and if their hearts have softened and they've become healthy, whole, godly people. So he sets up a scenario. Joseph says, all right, here's the deal. I've got some food for you. You can all take it and go home, but Benjamin, your brother, has to stay here. Benjamin became Jacob's favorite boy in the absence of Joseph. And he has brilliantly set up the exact same scenario from 20 years earlier when they sold Joseph into slavery. Benjamin is now the favorite son of Jacob. And if they betray Benjamin, they can all go free. Just like they betrayed Joseph and they could all go free and live happy lives. At least they thought. But Judah is the one who spoke up. Judah, the one who recognized his sin, was the one who was ready to speak up. Judah said, now then, please let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see the misery that would come on my father. Judah says, no. Don't let Benjamin stay. Let me stay in his place. My life for his life. Judah practices substitutionary atonement. Benjamin was under the sentence of death. Judah says, let me take his place. Let me suffer in his place. Let me fall under the sentence of death so my brothers can all go free. And at this, Joseph knew Judah's heart had changed. This was a man who recognized his shortcoming. This was a man who recognized his sin and confessed his guilt. And then it was safe for Joseph to reveal himself to his brothers because they recognized what they had done. But back to the story of Judah. That's what we're talking about today. So Tamar was pregnant with Judah's children, her father-in-law's children. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand, so the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, you're waiting for it now, aren't you? Suspenseful. This one came out first. But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out, and she said, so this is how you have broken out. And he was named Perez. Perez means to break out or to break through. That's what the name Perez means. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was given the name Zerah. Zerah means second place is first loser. So the boys are born. I just made that up. That's not true. The boys are born, Perez and Zerah, and Judah became the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. And Matthew includes all of them in the story of Christmas. And here's why he does it, if you're taking notes. Zerah tells us why. Perez tells us why. Christmas is the story of God's grace breaking out into the lives of people who don't seek it and don't deserve it. Just like Perez broke out, God's grace breaks out into the lives of people like Judah who don't seek it and who don't deserve it. And that's what Christmas is. It's God's grace breaking out of heaven, breaking into a world, a fallen world, a sinful world, filled with people like us who don't seek it and don't deserve it. People who justify our guilt and hide our guilt instead of recognizing it and saying, yeah, this is what I've done. This is who I am. This is my failure. But that's the way to be free from our feelings of guilt. This is what Judah discovered during his life. The only way to be free from your guilt is not to keep your past hidden away as a dirty little secret. The way to be free from the guilt of your past, the way to be free from guilt is to recognize, this is what I have done, and I'm not going to justify it. I'm not going to hide it. I'm going to confess my sin before the Lord. Tamar saved Judah when she made him recognize his sin. She saved his heart. She changed his heart. God's grace broke out. It broke through into the life of Judah as he recognized what he had done. And that's why Judah gets to be part of the Christmas story, because there's a better Judah. The reason why Tamar got to live at the end of the story was because Judah said to her, in spite of your sin, you are righteous. But there's a better Judah, isn't there? The person who became part of Jesus' family tree, the bad apple who became part of the family tree of Jesus. Judah said to Tamar, in spite of your sin, you are righteous. But the better Judah, Jesus declares, in spite of your sin, you are righteous. In spite of your sin, you are righteous, because the story of Christmas is about Jesus coming into the world to live in your place, to practice substitutionary atonement, to give his life instead of your life, to let your sentence of death fall on him. And on the cross, he paid the debt of your sin. And Jesus, the true Judah, says, as you recognize your sin, I am making you righteous, forgiven. People of God. That's why Judah is part of the Christmas story. That's why Matthew makes us go all the way through this back history to say Judah was the father of Perez, whose mother had been Tamar. Because that's the point of the Christmas story. So, here's my question. How heavy is your guilt? That weight, that moral indebtedness, whether it's to God or to someone else or to you, that moral indebtedness, that was caused by your sin. But it is today being fueled by your secrecy. So what if, like Judah, today you decided, I'm not going to justify it anymore. I'm not going to hide it anymore. I'm going to recognize. I'm going to own it. And I'm going to take it to the cross, where Jesus says, in spite of your sin, you are righteous. That's the way to get out of debt. That's the way to get out of guilt. And that's the point of the story of Christmas. We'll pick it up there next Sunday. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you that we have this incredible story of the life of Judah and Tamar. Thank you that the moral of the Christmas story is that morals don't get us into your story. We don't see these wonderful exemplars in the Bible of how to live and how to be good. What we see are failures and sinners and people with dirty little secrets. And that means the story of Christmas is the story of all of us. So today, give us courage to be people who recognize our sin. That we would not practice self-justification and we would not hide sins in the past, but we would recognize, here is our failure, Lord, we bring it to you. Here is our sin, we lay it all down at the cross because the greater Judah says, I make you righteous. Let that truth penetrate our hearts and our minds so that we can be people who live free from the weight and burden of guilt. A people who have been declared righteous and holy in your sight. Let this truth sink deeply into our hearts today by grace. We ask it in the name of Jesus, our Savior. Amen.